It started like any other Monday morning. The office buzzed with the usual clatter of keyboards and low murmurs of coworkers exchanging weekend stories. At first glance, it was just another ordinary day in a corporate setting, where deadlines, coffee cups, and polite small talk ruled the atmosphere. But for Layla, today would turn out to be anything but ordinary. Layla was a hard-working, dedicated employee. She had joined the company a year ago, bringing a spark of energy and ideas to a team that had grown stale under the weight of routine. Always smiling, always professional, she was the kind of person who turned heads, not just because of her striking presence but because of her relentless positivity in a world that wasn't always kind to her. Her colleagues respected her, and even clients seemed drawn to her charisma. Yet, there was one person who didn't see it that way. Enter Mr. Whitman, the boss. A man who believed power was measured by how much fear you could instill in others. Tall, sharply dressed, and utterly devoid of empathy, he prided himself on running a tight ship. But behind his firm handshake and polished words lay something darker. He was the kind of boss who saw people as numbers, not individuals. And when it came to Layla, his views extended beyond professionalism into something far more insidious. Whitman had made his disdain for Layla clear from the beginning. Subtle comments disguised as jokes. Assignments that were purposefully overwhelming. And that condescending tone he reserved just for her. Like she was always one mistake away from proving whatever assumption he'd already made about her. Layla felt it, and so did everyone around her. Yet she never complained. She'd always believed that her work ethic would speak louder than his prejudice. But on this particular Monday, everything changed. Whitman called Layla into his office just after lunch. The air was heavy with tension as she stepped inside. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Instead, he launched into a list of so-called issues with her performance, none of which had ever been mentioned before. Layla listened calmly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding. She knew where this was going. And then, the words came. "I'm sorry, Layla, this just isn't working out." Her breath caught, fired, just like that, no warning, no legitimate reason. She stared at him, searching his face for even a shred of decency, but there was none. He had already moved on, shuffling papers, signaling that the conversation was over. Layla left the office in a daze. Her colleagues whispered in shock as she walked by, their eyes wide with disbelief. Everyone knew she didn't deserve this. Everyone knew what had really happened, but no one dared to speak up. What Whitman didn't know, what no one in that office knew, was that Layla's husband was no ordinary man. As she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face, she made a call. Her voice shook as she explained what had happened, but on the other end of the line, there was no hesitation. "Don't worry, Layla," he said firmly. "I've got this." And just like that, the wheels were set in motion for a reckoning that would shake the entire company to its core. Whitman thought he had all the power. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The following morning, Whitman strolled into the office with his usual air of smug confidence. To him, Layla was already a forgotten memory, another casualty of what he liked to call upholding standards. He didn't think twice about the murmurs that filled the office, brushing them off as gossip about another underwhelming employee being shown the door. Meanwhile, Layla sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee she could barely taste. Her emotions were a whirlwind: anger, sadness, humiliation. But most of all, she felt a growing determination. She glanced at her phone, where a message from her husband lit up the screen. Meeting set for noon. Trust me, her husband, Marcus, wasn't just her rock. He was a man of quiet but undeniable influence, someone who had built a reputation for fairness, integrity, and, when necessary, delivering justice in ways that left no room for doubt. As an attorney specializing in workplace discrimination cases, he had seen countless stories like Layla's, stories that often didn't have a voice to tell them. But this time, it was personal. By the time noon rolled around, Whitman was seated at the head of the conference table, his usual spot of dominance during team meetings. He scanned the room, noting the mix of nervous glances and forced smiles from his staff. His sense of control remained unshaken until the door opened. The man who stepped inside carried an energy that immediately shifted the room. Marcus, dressed in a tailored suit, with a calm yet commanding presence, locked eyes with Whitman. "Mr. Whitman," Marcus said, extending a hand. "Marcus Jones, I believe we have some things to discuss." Whitman's confusion quickly morphed into unease. "I don't recall scheduling a meeting with you," he replied curtly, not taking the offered hand. "No, you didn't," Marcus said, his tone as unyielding as steel. "But given the circumstances surrounding my wife's termination, I thought it was time we had a conversation." It took a moment for the words to sink in. Whitman's face turned an odd shade of red as he sputtered, "Your wife?" I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly placed a folder on the table, opening it to reveal a meticulously organized collection of emails, performance reviews, and legal precedents. "This," he said, sliding the folder toward Whitman, "is a record of Layla's exemplary work performance, as well as a detailed account of the treatment she endured under your management." The room fell silent. The staff, who had been too scared to speak up before, sat wide-eyed as Marcus laid out the case piece by piece. Every dismissive comment, every unfounded criticism, every subtle but undeniable act of discrimination, it was all there, and it painted a damning picture. Whitman tried to interrupt, to deflect, but Marcus wasn't having it. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You didn't just fire an employee yesterday. You targeted and humiliated someone who gave her best to this company despite the obstacles you put in her way. And now, you're going to face the consequences of your actions." Whitman's bravado faltered. For the first time, he looked genuinely rattled. He glanced around the room, but no one met his gaze. The power he had wielded so freely seemed to be slipping through his fingers. "Are you threatening me?" he finally managed to say, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "No," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "I'm giving you an opportunity to do the right thing before this situation escalates further. Because trust me, Mr. Whitman, this is just the beginning." The room buzzed with an electric tension. Whitman's mind raced as he considered his options. He could double down, as he always had, or he could acknowledge what was now painfully clear. He was outmatched. But Marcus wasn't done. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "You may think you're untouchable, but you've underestimated the strength of the people you try to push down. And for the record, this isn't just about Layla anymore. It's about every person you've mistreated in this office. Believe me, they're watching." At that moment, a faint murmur of agreement rippled through the staff. Whitman looked around, realizing that his control over the room had been shattered. And that's when Marcus delivered his final words, a statement that left no room for argument. "You have 24 hours to make this right, or I'll make sure you never treat another employee this way again." With that, Marcus stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked out of the room. The staff sat in stunned silence, while Whitman remained frozen in his chair, staring at the folder that had dismantled his carefully constructed facade. The clock was ticking, and Whitman, for the first time in his career, was at the mercy of someone else's power. Layla sat in the quiet of her living room, staring at the phone in her hand. The call with Marcus had been brief, but his voice carried a reassurance she desperately needed. Still, doubt lingered in her mind. Would this really change anything? She'd worked so hard to prove herself, to rise above every obstacle thrown her way. Yet, in the end, it seemed like none of it mattered. Her thoughts drifted back to her first day at the company. She'd walked into that office feeling hopeful, determined to make a difference. The job wasn't just about a paycheck. It was a chance to do meaningful work, to build something she could be proud of. She had imagined a future where her efforts would be recognized, where she would grow and thrive. But Whitman had shattered that dream piece by piece. It started small, almost unnoticeable. He'd dismiss her ideas in meetings, only to later present them as his own. He'd assign her tasks that were either impossible to complete or so trivial they felt like an insult to her skills. At first, Layla convinced herself it wasn't personal. She thought if she just worked harder, she could prove her worth. But as the weeks turned into months, the pattern became undeniable. One incident stood out in her memory. It was during a team brainstorming session, and Layla had come prepared with a proposal she'd spent days perfecting. As she spoke, she noticed Whitman's expression, a subtle smirk that told her he wasn't listening. When she finished, he didn't even acknowledge her contribution. Instead, he turned to a junior colleague and asked for their input, completely bypassing her. Later that day, a coworker approached her in private. "I just wanted to say your idea was brilliant," they said, glancing around nervously as if they might be overheard. "I'm sorry Whitman didn't give you the credit you deserve." Layla had smiled and thanked them, but the moment left a bitter taste. It wasn't just the lack of recognition, it was the realization that others saw what was happening and felt powerless to stop it. Marcus had been her sounding board through it all. Every night, She'd come home and share her frustrations, and he'd listen patiently, his steady presence grounding her. He'd often urge her to document everything, to keep a record of the slights and the microaggressions. At the time, she wasn't sure why it mattered. She'd told herself it wasn't worth making waves, that she could handle it on her own. But now, she was grateful for his foresight. As she sat there, replaying the events of the past year in her mind, a message popped up on her phone. It was from a former coworker, someone who had left the company months ago. "I heard what happened," it read. "I'm so sorry. If you need anything, let me know. Whitman's been getting away with this for too long." Layla stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. This wasn't the first time someone had hinted at Whitman's behavior. She'd heard whispers about other employees, people who had quietly left the company after similar treatment. But no one had ever confronted him directly. The weight of it all pressed down on her. It wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a system that allowed people like Whitman to thrive while others suffered in silence. At the same time, over at the office, Whitman was pacing in his glass-walled corner office. He'd spent the morning trying to focus on his usual routine, but the encounter with Marcus had thrown him off balance. Who was this man, and how did he seem so unshakable? Whitman prided himself on being the one in control, the one who dictated the terms. Yet, Marcus had walked in and flipped the script entirely. He sat down at his desk, opening his laptop to review Layla's personnel file. As he scrolled through her glowing performance reviews, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He had hoped to find something, anything, that could justify his decision to fire her. But there was nothing. Every review praised her work ethic, her creativity, her ability to build relationships with clients and colleagues alike. Whitman's frustration boiled over. He slammed the laptop shut and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe he had underestimated her. Maybe this was going to be harder to sweep under the rug than he thought. Meanwhile, Marcus was making calls of his own. He'd spent the morning connecting with former employees who had worked under Whitman. Some were hesitant, wary of getting involved, but others were eager to share their stories. The pattern was undeniable. Whitman had a long history of targeting employees he perceived as a threat, especially women and people of color. One call stood out. A woman named Karen, who had worked in the same department as Layla 2 years ago, recounted her experience in vivid detail. She described how Whitman had undermined her at every turn, how he'd spread rumors about her to other managers, and how she eventually resigned to protect her mental health. "I always regretted not fighting back," Karen said. "If there's anything I can do to help now, count me in." By the time Marcus hung up, he had a growing list of allies who were ready to support Layla's case. He knew this wasn't just about exposing Whitman, it was about sending a message to the company and the industry as a whole. Back at the office, the atmosphere was tense. Word of Marcus's visit had spread quickly, and employees were abuzz with speculation. Some felt a spark of hope, daring to believe that Whitman's reign of intimidation might finally come to an end. Others were skeptical, fearing that nothing would change. Whitman, for his part, tried to project confidence. He called an impromptu meeting with the HR department, framing Layla's termination as a standard business decision. But the HR manager, a seasoned professional who had long suspected Whitman's biases, wasn't convinced. She listened, carefully, taking note of the inconsistencies in his explanations. As the day wore on, Whitman found himself increasingly isolated. His usual allies in the office, those who had benefited from his favoritism, kept their distance, sensing that aligning with him might now be a liability. By the end of the day, Whitman was sitting alone in his office, staring out the window at the city skyline. For the first time in his career, he felt the sting of vulnerability. And he hated it. Layla, on the other hand, was beginning to feel a flicker of hope. Marcus had promised her he would handle this, and if there was one thing she knew about her husband, it was that he never made promises lightly. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. What if Whitman found a way to spin the narrative in his favor? What if the company chose to protect him instead of holding him accountable? As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, Layla picked up her phone and dialed Marcus's number. "How are things going?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Everything's moving in the right direction," Marcus replied. "But there's still work to be done. Just hang tight, Layla. Trust me." And despite her lingering doubts, she did. Because deep down, she knew Marcus wouldn't stop until justice was served. The next morning, Layla woke up early. Sleep had been fleeting, her mind spinning with fragments of the past and an uncertain future. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Marcus was already gone, leaving behind a steaming cup of coffee and a note on the kitchen counter. Asterisk, keep your head up. Big day ahead, I love you. She smiled despite herself, folding the note and tucking it into her pocket. As much as she trusted Marcus, the knots in her stomach refused to loosen. She couldn't shake the image of Whitman's smug expression when he fired her, the cold finality in his voice. She had always believed in the power of resilience, but Whitman's actions had left a deep bruise on her confidence. Meanwhile, Marcus was already at work. His office, usually a place of quiet focus, was bustling with activity. He'd pulled together a small team of trusted colleagues to assist with Layla's case. The walls were lined with sticky notes, timelines, and printouts of correspondence, each piece fitting into a puzzle that was beginning to reveal the full scope of Whitman's misconduct. Okay, Marcus said, addressing the group. We've got enough evidence to make a solid case, but I want to be sure we're covering all our bases. Let's revisit everything: emails, performance reviews, witness statements. If there's a crack in Whitman's story, we'll find it. One of his colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman named Nia, raised her hand. What about the company itself? Do we have any indication that they've been aware of his behavior? Marcus nodded. Good question. That's the next layer. If there's a pattern here, and I'm confident there is, then someone higher up must have known and turned a blind eye. If we can prove that, it'll force their hand. They won't be able to protect him without exposing themselves. Back at the office, Whitman was doing his best to maintain a facade of control. He held meetings, sent out emails, and even cracked a few jokes, but his usual confidence felt forced. The tension in the office was palpable. Employees whispered in clusters, glancing nervously toward Whitman's glass-walled office. What unnerved him most wasn't Marcus or even Layla. It was the way his staff was behaving. People who had once been eager to please him now avoided eye contact. His authority, once absolute, seemed to be slipping away. That afternoon, he received a call from the company's legal department. Mr. Whitman, the voice on the other end said, cool and professional. We've been informed of some allegations concerning your management practices. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss this matter. Whitman's stomach dropped. Allegations? He repeated, trying to sound unbothered. From who? I'm not at liberty to disclose that at the moment, the voice replied. But we'll need you to provide documentation regarding your decision to terminate Layla Jones. Specifically, any performance issues or disciplinary actions that led to her dismissal. Whitman gritted his teeth. He had no such documentation. Layla's record was spotless, and he knew it. I'll get that to you, he said, forcing a calm tone before hanging up. As the day dragged on, Whitman became increasingly paranoid. He sent emails to HR, asking for updates on any complaints filed against him. He even called a few of his most loyal employees into his office, fishing for information. But the responses were vague and unhelpful. Whitman knew he was running out of time. Meanwhile, Marcus was making significant progress. He'd uncovered a string of incidents involving Whitman that painted a clear picture of his behavior. Former employees had provided testimonies, detailing how they were mistreated, undermined, and eventually pushed out of the company. One brave individual had even shared a recording of a meeting where Whitman made blatantly inappropriate remarks. Got him, Marcus said, a note of triumph in his voice as he played the recording for his team. Now we just need to present this in a way the company can't ignore, Nia added. Marcus nodded. We're almost there. Let's put together a comprehensive report, one that doesn't just highlight Whitman's actions but also implicates the company if they've failed to act. By the end of the day, the report was ready. Marcus reviewed it carefully, making sure every detail was airtight. He sent it to the company's legal department with a simple message, asterisk, attached as a summary of the evidence we've gathered regarding discriminatory practices under Mr. Whitman's management. We are prepared to pursue legal action if this matter is not addressed promptly. As the email sent, Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. It was a small step, but an important one. Back at home, Layla was anxiously pacing the living room when Marcus walked through the door. Well, she asked, her voice a mix of hope and fear. Marcus smiled softly, placing his hands on her shoulders. It's in motion. They can't ignore this, Layla. Not anymore. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes welling up. I just want it to be over, she admitted. I know, Marcus said, pulling her into a hug. But you've already won, Layla. By standing up to him, you've done something most people wouldn't dare to do. Whatever happens next, you've already proven your strength. Layla clung to those words, letting them soothe the ache in her chest. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been in her position. The following morning, Whitman arrived at the office to find an email from the legal department waiting in his inbox. The subject line read, "Urgent, review required, complaint against management practices." His heart sank as he opened the email, his eyes scanning the detailed report attached. It was worse than he imagined. Every incident, every pattern of behavior, every complaint, laid out in stark detail. The final page contained a clear directive. You are required to attend a formal review meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Failure to provide sufficient justification for your actions may result in disciplinary measures, up to and including termination. Whitman's hands trembled as he closed his laptop. For the first time in his career, he felt the one thing he had always believed himself immune to: fear. And for the first time, he realized that he might not win this time. Whitman didn't sleep that night. He sat in his dimly lit apartment, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table in front of him. The email replayed in his mind like a broken record. This was the kind of situation he had always managed to avoid, sidestepping blame, charming his way out of accountability. But this time felt different. Marcus's unrelenting calm and the sheer weight of the evidence had shaken him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He thought about calling his lawyer, but something stopped him. There was no legal spin that could undo the damage if the company decided to cut him loose. Worse still, he knew that if this escalated publicly, his reputation would be in tatters. The carefully crafted image he had cultivated for years would crumble, and there'd be no recovering from that. At the same time, Layla was finding herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. Word of Marcus's involvement and the evidence he had gathered was spreading, not just among her former co-workers but across professional networks. She began receiving messages from strangers, some offering support, others sharing their own experiences with workplace discrimination. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Angela, who worked in a completely different department at the company. She described how she'd been overlooked for promotions despite her stellar performance, often in favor of male colleagues with less experience. "I don't know if this helps," Angela wrote, "but I've kept records of everything. If you or your husband think this could strengthen your case, I'm happy to share." Layla forwarded the message to Marcus, who immediately reached out to Angela. The conversation confirmed what he had suspected. The problem wasn't just Whitman. It was systemic. "This is bigger than we thought," Marcus told Layla later that evening. "Whitman's actions are a symptom, not the root cause. If the company has been complicit in fostering this environment, we can use that to apply even more pressure." Layla listened, her emotions a mix of anger and determination. She thought back to all the times she had second-guessed herself, wondering if she was being too sensitive or reading too much into Whitman's behavior. But hearing stories like Angela's made it clear, she wasn't alone, and this wasn't just about her. While Marcus continued building the case, Whitman decided to take matters into his own hands. Early the next morning, he called an unscheduled meeting with his boss, a senior executive named Mr. Langford. Whitman walked into Langford's office, attempting to project confidence despite the turmoil brewing inside him. "Langford," Whitman began, shutting the door behind him, "I need to talk to you about the allegations that have been brought against me." Langford looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Go on," he said. Whitman launched into a carefully rehearsed defense, framing the complaints as baseless attacks from disgruntled employees. He painted himself as a misunderstood leader who had only ever acted in the company's best interests. "I've delivered results," Whitman said, his tone firm. "Profits are up, and the team has consistently hit their targets under my management. This whole thing is a distraction, and I need the company to back me up." Langford listened in silence, his face giving nothing away. When Whitman finally finished, the older man leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Results are important, Whitman," Langford said slowly, "but so is the way we achieve them. The company's reputation is on the line here. If these allegations hold any weight, we can't afford to sweep them under the rug." Whitman felt a surge of panic. "You can't be serious," he said. "After everything I've done for this company, you're going to let some baseless accusations ruin my career?" Langford's gaze hardened. "It's not just about you. If this goes public, the fallout could be catastrophic. I suggest you start preparing for the possibility that you might not come out of this unscathed. Whitman left the office feeling more isolated than ever. For the first time, he realized that his usual tactics, charm, manipulation, intimidation, weren't going to save him. Meanwhile, Marcus was preparing for a pivotal moment. He had arranged a meeting with the company's legal team, presenting the evidence not as a demand, but as an opportunity for the company to take responsibility. You have a choice, Marcus said, his voice steady and firm. You can address this internally, make the necessary changes, and show the world that you take these issues seriously. Or you can fight us, and I promise you, the cost will be much higher, not just in legal fees, but in reputation. The legal team exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Marcus was right. The evidence was overwhelming, and the growing number of testimonies from current and former employees only made their position weaker. Back at the office, tensions continued to rise. Employees who had once felt powerless began to speak up, sharing their own experiences and supporting one another. Layla's story had sparked something, a collective realization that they didn't have to accept mistreatment as the norm. By the end of the week, Whitman's situation had gone from bad to worse. He received an official notice from HR, requiring him to step down temporarily while the investigation continued. It was a humiliating blow, one he hadn't seen coming. That night, as he sat in his dark apartment, he couldn't help but wonder how things had spiraled so far out of his control. For years, he had been untouchable, climbing the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency. But now, the very people he had dismissed and belittled were the ones bringing him down. For Layla, the fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope. She had spent so long trying to survive in silence, but now, her voice, and the voices of so many others, was finally being heard. Marcus sat beside her on the couch, reviewing a new batch of testimonies that had come in. He glanced at Layla, seeing the mixture of exhaustion and determination in her eyes. We're getting there, he said quietly. Layla nodded. I just want people to understand that this isn't just about me, she said. It's about changing the system so no one else has to go through this. Marcus reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. And that's exactly what we're going to do. As the days passed, the tension continued to build. The company faced mounting pressure to act, both from within and outside its walls. The question wasn't just whether Whitman would face consequences, it was whether the company would take responsibility for the culture that allowed him to thrive. The stakes were higher than ever, and the resolution remained uncertain. But one thing was clear, the truth had been unleashed, and there was no turning back. The air in the office was heavier than ever, as if everyone could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Whitman's absence, though temporary, had sent ripples through the company. His name was spoken in hushed tones, and employees avoided his glass-walled office, now dark and empty. Layla watched from afar as the storm she had unwillingly ignited grew stronger. She couldn't help but feel conflicted. Part of her was relieved that Whitman was finally facing repercussions for his actions. But another part, the part that still carried the scars of years of silent endurance, felt the burden of being the face of a battle much larger than herself. Marcus, ever the strategist, kept pushing forward. Each day brought new revelations as more employees came forward with stories of discrimination, unfair treatment, or outright abuse under Whitman's leadership. What had started as a single act of retaliation against Layla had now grown into a full-blown reckoning. One evening, Marcus received a call from a reporter who had caught wind of the case. The journalist, a sharp and persistent woman named Dana, had been digging into the company's history and found patterns that went far beyond Whitman. This isn't just about one manager, Dana said over the phone. The culture here has been toxic for years. I've spoken to former employees who say they left because they felt undervalued and ignored. Layla's story is powerful, but it's part of a much bigger narrative. Marcus hesitated. He was torn between wanting to amplify Layla's voice and the risk of escalating the situation beyond their control. I appreciate your interest, he said carefully, but my wife has been through enough already. This isn't about making headlines, it's about making things right. Dana respected his caution but made it clear she wasn't giving up. If you change your mind, let me know. Stories like this have the power to bring real change. As Marcus hung up, Layla walked into the room, sensing his unease. Who was that? She asked. A reporter, Marcus replied. She wants to take this public. Layla sat down beside him, her brow furrowed in thought. What do you think? I think she's right, Marcus admitted. This could be bigger than us. But it's your decision, Layla. You've already given so much of yourself to this fight. You don't owe anyone more than you're willing to give. Layla stared at the floor, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. She knew that going public would mean exposing herself to scrutiny, criticism, and even backlash. But it would also mean shining a light on the injustices so many others had endured in silence. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady. Meanwhile, Whitman was scrambling to regain control. From the confines of his home office, he began reaching out to his network of allies, hoping to rally support. But his calls were met with cold indifference or outright avoidance. "Sorry, Whitman," one former colleague said bluntly. "No one wants to be associated with this right now. You're radioactive." Even his attempts to contact Langford went unanswered. For a man who had built his career on connections and influence, the sudden isolation was a bitter pill to swallow. As the days passed, the company's internal investigation gained momentum. The legal team, armed with Marcus's meticulously compiled evidence, began conducting interviews with employees. What they found was damning. Whitman's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern that had gone unchecked for years. Langford, feeling the pressure mounting from all sides, called an emergency meeting with the board of directors. "We have a serious problem on our hands," Langford began, addressing the group. "Whitman's actions are indefensible, but our failure to address complaints and enforce accountability makes us just as culpable. If we don't act decisively, the fallout could be catastrophic." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Langford was right, but the implications of admitting fault were daunting. "What are you proposing?" one member asked. "First, we need to sever ties with Whitman," Langford replied. "No severance, no golden parachute. He's a liability we can't afford. Second, we need to issue a public statement acknowledging our shortcomings and outlining a plan for meaningful change. It's the only way to start rebuilding trust." The decision wasn't unanimous, but the urgency of the situation left little room for dissent. Whitman was informed of the board's decision the next morning. When the call came, Whitman's voice cracked as he tried to argue. "You're making a mistake," he said, desperation creeping into his tone. "I've been loyal to this company for years. You can't just throw me under the bus." But Langford's response was cold and final. "Your loyalty doesn't absolve you of responsibility. This is the end of the road, Whitman." Word of Whitman's termination spread quickly, but the story was far from over. The company's public statement, while acknowledging past failures, stopped short of taking full accountability. For Marcus and Layla, it was a step in the right direction but not enough. They knew that real change would require more than a carefully worded press release. It would take systemic reform. As they prepared for the next phase of their fight, Layla found herself reflecting on how far they had come. She thought about the countless people who had reached out to share their stories, the growing chorus of voices demanding justice. "This isn't just about bringing Whitman down," Layla said to Marcus one evening. "It's about building something better, something that values people, not just profits." Marcus nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "And that's exactly what we're going to do." The tension remained, the future uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Layla felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her own pain. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel small. And as the days turned into weeks, that purpose became her guiding light, illuminating a path forward through the darkness. Layla felt a strange mix of dread and resolve as the story continued to snowball, taking on a life of its own. The company's statement had done little to satisfy the growing wave of public curiosity and outrage. Social media was alive with speculation, fueled by leaked snippets of the internal investigation and whispered rumors about the deeper rot in the corporate culture. Layla's name wasn't directly tied to the news yet, but the whispers were getting louder, and it felt like only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Meanwhile, Marcus was working tirelessly behind the scenes. Every conversation, every piece of evidence, every connection he could leverage was being funneled into a strategy that could force the company to take real, actionable responsibility. He knew they had hit Whitman hard, but Marcus wasn't interested in revenge. His goal was systemic change, and for that, the pressure had to keep building. One afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected email. It was from someone high up in the company, a woman named Samantha who had kept a low profile until now. Her message was brief but carried weight. "I've been following what's happening. I think I can help. Let's talk." When Marcus and Samantha connected later that evening, her voice was calm but resolute. She was a senior executive who had seen the company's toxic underbelly for years but had always felt powerless to act. "I've seen how they protect people like Whitman," she said. "And I've seen how people like Layla get pushed out, silenced, forgotten. I'm tired of being complicit." Marcus listened intently as Samantha laid out what she knew. She confirmed that the company's leadership had ignored numerous red flags about Whitman and others like him. Worse still, she hinted at internal documents that could prove it. "They've been preparing for a day like this for a long time," she said. "But they never expected someone like you to come along." As Marcus thanked Samantha and ended the call, he felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the breakthrough they needed, but it came with risks. If the company realized that one of their own was working against them, they would fight even harder to protect themselves. At the same time, Whitman's downfall had left a vacuum in the office, and tensions among the remaining leadership were at an all-time high. Whitman's closest allies were scrambling to distance themselves from him, but their efforts only drew more scrutiny. Employees who had been too afraid to speak out before were now emboldened, and every new revelation added fuel to the fire. Layla, meanwhile, was struggling with the growing visibility of her story. She hadn't intended to become a symbol for anything, but now people she'd never met were looking to her for hope, for guidance, for validation. Some messages were kind and supportive, but others were harsh and critical, accusing her of playing the victim or seeking attention. One evening, Layla sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, tears streaming silently down her face. Marcus walked in, immediately sensing that something was wrong. "They don't even know me," Layla whispered, her voice trembling. "They don't know what I've been through, and yet they act like they have the right to judge me." Marcus sat down beside her, pulling her into a hug. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said softly. "The people who matter, the ones who truly see what's happening, they're the ones standing with you." Layla nodded, wiping her tears. She knew Marcus was right, but the weight of it all still felt overwhelming. The next day, the tension reached a new peak when a whistleblower from the HR department leaked a damning internal memo to the press. The memo detailed how complaints against Whitman had been systematically downplayed or dismissed over the years. It named names, dates, and specific incidents, painting a clear picture of a company more interested in protecting its image than addressing wrongdoing. The leak sent shockwaves through the company and beyond. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, it wasn't just a workplace issue, it was a public scandal. Layla's story, though not explicitly named, was clearly at the center of it all. Langford called an emergency meeting with the remaining leadership team, his frustration barely contained. "We're losing control of the narrative," he said, pacing the room. "If we don't act now, we're going to be buried under this." But the room was divided. Some executives wanted to double down, deny everything, and shift the blame onto Whitman entirely. Others, including Samantha, argued that the only way forward was to acknowledge the company's failures and commit to real change. As the debate raged on, Marcus and Layla were preparing for their next move. Marcus had compiled a comprehensive dossier, including the information Samantha had shared, the leaked memo, and testimonials from dozens of employees. It was a powerful weapon, one that could force the company's hand if used strategically. But Marcus knew that timing was everything. If they moved too soon, the company might spin the narrative in their favor. If they waited too long, the momentum could fade. That night, Marcus and Layla sat together at the kitchen table, their plans spread out before them. "This is it," Marcus said quietly. "We're at the tipping point. One push, and they won't be able to ignore us anymore." Layla took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the documents that had come to define the past few weeks of her life. She thought about everything she had endured, the sacrifices she had made, and the people who were now looking to her for courage. "We do this," she said finally, her voice steady, "but we do it on our terms. No shortcuts, no compromises. This isn't just about tearing something down, it's about building something better." Marcus nodded, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. Together, they prepared to take the final step toward justice, knowing that the outcome was far from certain but refusing to back down. And as the night stretched on, the city quiet outside their window, the stage was set for the climax of a battle that had been years in the making. The tension hung thick in the air, the resolution just out of reach, as everyone waited for the moment when everything would come to a head. The next morning, the city seemed alive with anticipation. News outlets ran constant updates on the growing scandal, speculating on how the company would respond and whether Whitman would speak publicly. Employees whispered nervously in hallways, while management scrambled to contain the fallout. The pressure was palpable, and everyone knew something big was about to happen. For Marcus and Layla, the day began early. Marcus had spent the night drafting a detailed open letter that would serve as their next move. The letter laid out the facts in plain, unflinching terms, calling out not just Whitman's behavior but the company's role in enabling it. It wasn't inflammatory or vengeful, it was factual and principled, a demand for accountability and change. "We send this to the press and release it online at the same time," Marcus said, pacing the room as he finalized the plan. "We control the narrative, no room for them to spin this or dismiss it." Layla read over the letter carefully, her heart pounding with every word. She knew the moment this went public, there would be no turning back. The support she had received so far had been a lifeline, but it couldn't shield her from the scrutiny that was sure to come. "I'm ready," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Marcus gave her a reassuring nod. "Then let's do this." Within hours, the letter was live, shared widely across social media and picked up by major news outlets. It was a bombshell, detailing years of systemic failures within the company and calling for an independent investigation into its practices. Marcus and Layla had taken great care to focus on the broader issues, framing the story as a wake-up call for corporate culture everywhere, not just a personal vendetta. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The letter went viral, sparking a tidal wave of commentary online. People from all walks of life weighed in, sharing their own experiences with workplace discrimination and praising Layla's courage. But there was also backlash, skeptics who questioned her motives and trolls who attacked her character. Layla tried to brace herself for the negativity, but it still hurt. "Why do they have to make this about me?" she said to Marcus, scrolling through the comments. "This is so much bigger than just one person." "Because you've become the face of it," Marcus said gently. "People need someone to look to, for better or worse. But that doesn't mean you have to carry it all alone." As the day wore on, the company was forced into damage control. Langford appeared on a live news broadcast, delivering a carefully prepared statement. "We take these allegations very seriously," he said, his tone somber. "An independent review is already underway, and we are committed to implementing meaningful reforms." But the statement rang hollow to many. It was clear that Langford and the rest of the leadership were more interested in salvaging the company's reputation than addressing the root causes of the problem. Meanwhile, Whitman was watching the chaos unfold from the confines of his home. His phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls, most of which he ignored. The media had been relentless, painting him as the villain of the story, and he felt the walls closing in. "They're making me the scapegoat," he muttered bitterly to himself, pacing the room. "I wasn't the only one. Why should I take all the blame?" Desperation drove him to action. That evening, Whitman gave an exclusive interview to a sympathetic journalist, hoping to shift the narrative. In the interview, he painted himself as a misunderstood leader who had been unfairly targeted. "I made mistakes," he admitted, "but I've been unfairly vilified. This isn't justice, it's a witch hunt." The interview only added fuel to the fire. Supporters of Layla and Marcus saw it as an attempt to deflect responsibility, while others latched onto Whitman's words as evidence that the situation had been blown out of proportion. Back at their apartment, Layla and Marcus watched the interview together, their frustration mounting. "He's trying to rewrite the story," Marcus said, shaking his head. "But he doesn't have the leverage anymore. People aren't buying it." The next day brought another twist. Samantha, the whistleblower who had risked everything to help, informed Marcus that the company was planning a major announcement. "They're trying to get ahead of this," she said in a hushed tone. "It's damage control, but it could also be their way of shutting the door on this completely." The announcement was scheduled for the following afternoon, and Marcus knew they had to be ready. He and Layla spent the evening strategizing, reaching out to allies and supporters, ensuring that their voices wouldn't be drowned out by whatever the company had planned. When the time came, the company's leadership team stood in front of a packed press room. Langford stepped up to the podium, flanked by HR representatives and legal counsel. Cameras flashed as he began to speak. "We acknowledge that mistakes have been made," Langford said, his tone measured and rehearsed. "And we are committed to making things right. Effective immediately, we are instituting a series of reforms designed to create a more inclusive and equitable workplace." The audience listened intently, but the tension in the room was palpable. Langford's words were carefully crafted, but they lacked the ring of genuine accountability. As the press conference continued, Marcus and Layla watched from home, their eyes locked on the screen. "This is it," Marcus said quietly. "This is the moment we've been building toward." The air seemed to crackle with anticipation, the weight of months of struggle coming to a head. Layla's hands trembled slightly as she reached for Marcus's. They had come so far, but the outcome was still uncertain. And as Langford's speech drew to a close, the room held its breath, waiting for the next move in a battle that had already changed so many lives. As Langford wrapped up his carefully constructed speech, a murmur began to ripple through the press room. Reporters shifted in their seats, glancing at their phones, their expressions shifting from passive observation to barely contained excitement. Something was happening, something no one in that room had anticipated. Back at home, Marcus's phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the screen as notifications flooded in. His jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, his full attention now on a message that had just arrived. "This can't be real," he muttered under his breath, his heart pounding. Layla turned to him, her concern immediate. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. Marcus hesitated, then handed her the phone. On the screen was a forwarded message from Samantha. It was a photo of a document, the header unmistakably marked with the company's logo. Below it, bold letters stood out, "Confidential internal memo, crisis containment plan." Layla's eyes widened as she read. The document wasn't just a plan, it was a playbook. It outlined strategies to deflect blame, minimize financial impact, and control the public narrative. It detailed how to handle whistleblowers, including specific steps to isolate and discredit employees who might pose a threat. "This isn't just damage control," Marcus said, his voice grim. "This is a calculated effort to bury the truth." Layla's hands shook as she put the phone down. "They're not trying to fix anything. They're just protecting themselves." The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. The company wasn't interested in change, it was interested in survival, no matter the cost. The polished words Langford had just delivered on live television were nothing more than a smokescreen. "What do we do?" Layla asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "We expose it," Marcus said without hesitation. "They can't be allowed to get away with this." But as they began to formulate their next move, another twist unfolded. A new post began circulating on social media, a leaked video showing Whitman in a private meeting with other senior managers, discussing how to handle problematic employees. In the grainy footage, Whitman's voice was unmistakable. "We can't afford to let these people think they can win," he said, his tone cold and calculated. "If we give them an inch, they'll take a mile. Handle it quietly, but make it clear, we don't tolerate troublemakers." The video was damning, a window into the toxic mindset that had been allowed to flourish under his leadership. But what shocked Marcus and Layla even more was what came next. At the end of the clip, another voice spoke up, calm, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. "Understood," the voice said. It was Langford. The realization hit like a lightning bolt. Langford hadn't just been complicit in Whitman's actions, he had actively supported and reinforced them. His public statements, his promises of reform, they were all lies. Layla felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce. "He knew," she said, her voice trembling. "He knew everything, and he let it happen." Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. "This changes everything," he said. "Langford isn't just part of the problem, he's the root of it." The leaked video spread like wildfire, and the public response was immediate. Langford's carefully crafted image began to crumble as people demanded answers. Employees, past and present, came forward with stories that painted an even darker picture of the company's culture. For Marcus and Layla, the stakes had never been higher. They had started this journey to hold Whitman accountable, but now they were up against something much bigger, a system designed to protect power at all costs. As they prepared for the next step, a knock at their door startled them. Marcus opened it cautiously, finding Samantha standing there, her face pale but determined. "They know it was me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been terminated, and they're threatening legal action if I speak out publicly." Layla stepped forward, her expression resolute. "Then we speak out for you," she said. "We're not letting them silence you, or anyone else." Samantha nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I have more," she said, pulling a USB drive from her pocket. "Documents, emails, meeting transcripts. It's all there. They've been covering this up for years." Marcus took the drive, his mind already spinning with possibilities. "This is it," he said. "This is the proof we need." But even as they celebrated this breakthrough, a sense of unease lingered. The company was powerful, with resources and connections that could crush even the most determined opposition. And with Langford's involvement now exposed, they knew the fight ahead would be unlike anything they had faced before. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, Marcus, Layla, and Samantha sat together, mapping out their next move. The stakes had never been higher, the risks never greater. But for the first time, they felt the faint glimmer of hope that justice might finally be within reach. Outside, the world waited, the tension thick in the air, as the battle for truth and accountability reached a boiling point. And in the quiet before the storm, one thing became clear: this fight was far from over. The silence that filled the room was heavy, but the three of them, Marcus, Layla, and Samantha, knew there was no time to dwell on fear. The USB drive in Marcus's hand was the key to unraveling everything, but they had to be strategic. Every step they took from this point forward would determine not just the outcome of their battle but the ripple effects for countless others who had suffered in silence under the company's oppressive culture. Layla broke the silence first. "We need to go public with this," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Not just the documents, everything. The video, the memo, the stories. People need to see the full picture." Marcus nodded, but his expression was pensive. "If we release everything at once, they'll scramble to discredit it. We need to control the rollout, keep them on their heels. Drop pieces strategically. Build the narrative so they can't spin it fast enough." Samantha hesitated, her eyes flickering to the USB drive. "What if they come after us?" she asked. "Not just legally. What if they dig into our lives, smear us? I've seen what they're capable of." "They'll try," Marcus said, meeting her gaze. "But the more they attack, the worse it'll look for them. That's why we need allies. People who can amplify this so it's not just us standing alone." Layla reached for Samantha's hand, squeezing it gently. "You've already risked so much to get us this far," she said. "You don't have to keep going if it's too much. But if you do, you won't be alone. We'll face whatever comes together." Samantha took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'm in," she said. "They took everything from me, my job, my reputation. If we don't stop them now, they'll just keep doing it to someone else." By morning, the plan was in motion. Marcus reached out to trusted journalists who had been covering the story, offering them exclusive access to the new evidence. Layla coordinated with online advocates who had been amplifying her story, ensuring the leaked documents would reach as many people as possible. Samantha worked in the background, compiling a detailed timeline of the company's cover-ups, tying together every thread. The first bombshell dropped that afternoon, an internal email chain between Langford and Whitman, discussing how to suppress a harassment complaint that had been filed by an employee years earlier. The emails were callous and dismissive, with Langford instructing Whitman to handle it quietly, and suggesting the employee be encouraged to leave the company. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. The hashtag handle it quietly began trending within hours, with people sharing their own stories of being silenced or dismissed by corporate leadership. Calls for Langford's resignation grew louder, and even some of the company's board members began distancing themselves from him. But the escalation didn't come without consequences. That evening, Marcus received an anonymous email warning him to stop. It contained no threats, just a single line. "You don't know who you're dealing with, **. Marcus showed the email to Layla, his jaw clenched. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said. "They want us to second-guess ourselves." Layla's eyes narrowed. "Then we don't stop," she said. "We push harder." The next day, Samantha's timeline was published in a major investigative piece, connecting the dots between years of complaints, ignored warnings, and active suppression of whistleblowers. The article was meticulously sourced, making it nearly impossible for the company to refute. It painted Langford not just as a passive participant but as a driving force behind the toxic culture that had plagued the organization. As the story spread, cracks began to appear in the company's facade. Former executives who had left on bad terms started coming forward, confirming details from the timeline and adding new ones. One even admitted to having been pressured by Langford to destroy evidence of a harassment complaint. Inside the company, panic set in. Langford called an emergency meeting with the board, but tensions were high, and trust was non-existent. Several members openly questioned whether Langford was fit to lead, and rumors of a possible ouster began circulating. But Langford wasn't going down without a fight. That evening, he appeared on a primetime news program, painting himself as a victim of a coordinated smear campaign. He denied any wrongdoing and accused Layla, Marcus, and Samantha of manipulating the truth for personal gain. The interview infuriated Layla. "He's doubling down on the lies," she said, pacing the room. "How can he still act like he's the victim?" Marcus remained calm, though his mind was racing. "Because he knows he's losing," he said. "This is desperation. He's trying to rally whatever support he has left." The next twist came later that night, when an anonymous tipster sent a new video to one of the journalists working with Marcus. The video showed a private conversation between Langford and several board members, recorded just weeks earlier. In it, Langford admitted to knowing about multiple harassment complaints against Whitman and expressed frustration that people won't just let things go. The journalist forwarded the video to Marcus, who watched it with a mix of shock and determination. "This is it," he said, turning to Layla and Samantha. "This is the final nail in the coffin." As they prepared to release the video, the weight of what they were doing hit them all. They weren't just fighting for accountability. They were dismantling a system that had been designed to protect people like Langford and Whitman at the expense of everyone else. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had their resolve. Together, they braced for the storm that was sure to follow, knowing that the fight was far from over but refusing to back down. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the world waited, the tension mounting, for the moment when the truth would finally come crashing down. The moment Marcus hit send, the world seemed to hold its breath. The video of Langford, caught in his own words, quickly spread across social media. It was the tipping point, the smoking gun that no one could ignore. By the time the sun rose, Langford's entire world had collapsed. The story was everywhere, the video playing on repeat across news channels and websites. Layla, Marcus, and Samantha watched in stunned silence as the company's board members held an emergency meeting to discuss Langford's future. But it wasn't just Langford's downfall that captivated the media. The sheer scale of the cover-up began to unravel. Old employees, former managers, and whistleblowers from years past flooded social media with their stories, each one more shocking than the last. What had started as Layla's fight had snowballed into a nationwide conversation about corporate corruption, abuse of power, and the toxic work environments so many had suffered in silence. Langford, in a last-ditch effort to save himself, went into hiding, refusing to answer calls or make public statements. The company quickly stripped him of his position, announcing a formal investigation into his conduct. But the damage had been done. Langford was no longer a leader. He was a pariah, his reputation shattered beyond repair. The board's announcement of a new CEO came as no surprise. It was someone from the outside, someone with a reputation for being fair and transparent. But the damage to the company's image was irreparable. Stock prices plummeted, clients pulled their contracts, and employees left in droves. Layla felt a strange mix of triumph and emptiness as the media spotlight shifted. She had won, for herself, for Marcus, for all the other people who had been silenced. But it wasn't enough to erase the pain, the years of injustice she had endured. The fight was over, but the scars remained. "You did it," Marcus said quietly, his hand resting on her shoulder. He had been there every step of the way, supporting her, standing by her when she had no one else. But now, with Langford gone and the company crumbling, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Did we?" Layla replied softly, "Is it really over?" But as they spoke, there was a shift in the air. The phone rang, the ringtone echoing in the stillness. Marcus answered it, his eyes widening in disbelief as he listened. "It can't be," Marcus said, shaking his head. "No, I don't believe it." Layla looked at him, confused. "What is it?" Marcus dropped the phone onto the table, his hands trembling slightly. "It's the whistleblower, Samantha. They've just arrested her." The room fell silent. For a moment, Layla couldn't process what she had just heard. "What do you mean?" She gave us everything. She helped us. They can't, apparently, she's being charged with theft of company property," Marcus said, his voice tight. "They've found a way to turn this around on her. They're claiming she stole confidential documents during her time at the company." Layla's stomach churned. The twist was almost too much to bear. Just when they thought they had finally brought the truth to light, the system was still working to protect the ones at the top. They had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. "We have to help her," Layla said, her voice steady with resolve. "This can't be how it ends." Marcus nodded, already thinking ahead. "I'll make some calls. There's no way they can get away with this. Not after everything that's happened." But as they scrambled to figure out what to do next, a new message popped up on Marcus's phone. The screen displayed a simple, unsettling text. Asterisk. You're next. Asterisk. They stared at the message, the weight of it settling in. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. The forces they were up against were deeper and more dangerous than they had realized. Layla looked at Marcus, her face hardening. We're not backing down, she said. Not now, not ever. As they set the plan in motion to clear Samantha's name, a dark realization began to creep in. The battle they thought they had won was only the beginning. There were more powerful players in this game, and they weren't going to let a few whistleblowers derail everything. The final twist came when Layla received a call from an unknown number. She answered it cautiously, her heart racing. Layla, a voice said, low and familiar. It's me, Whitman. Layla froze. Whitman? The same man who had fired her without a second thought, the one who had been at the heart of it all. What was he doing calling now? What do you want? She asked, her voice tight with distrust. I want to make you an offer, Whitman said, his voice surprisingly calm. I know you think you've won, but you haven't. The company's not going down without a fight. And neither am I if you want to stop this from escalating even further. I have something you'll want. Layla's mind raced. She could feel the walls closing in, the stakes growing higher with every word. What could you possibly have that I'd want? Evidence, Whitman replied. Evidence that will blow everything wide open. But you need to play the game if you want it. I'm willing to trade, but only if you agree to a deal. Layla's pulse quickened, her instincts on high alert. What kind of deal? If you want to stop Samantha from being framed, if you want to protect everything you've worked for, you'll have to do something for me. One thing, and I'll give you the proof you need to end this for good. Layla was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had fought so hard to get to this point, and now, it seemed that even victory came with strings attached. But then a thought hit her. What if Whitman had been playing her all along? What if the evidence was just another trap to keep her in the game, to force her into submission? She couldn't trust him, not after everything that had happened. I'll never make a deal with you, Layla said, her voice low and resolute. You're just another part of the problem. The line went silent for a moment. Then, Whitman's voice returned, colder than before. Then don't say I didn't warn you. The call ended abruptly, leaving Layla with a knot in her stomach. She had no idea what he meant by his cryptic warning, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The fight for justice, for truth, would continue. And she would fight, no matter what, until the very end. As the call ended, Layla stood frozen, staring at the phone in her hand, her mind racing with questions. What had Whitman meant by his warning? Was this another ploy to rattle her, or had he truly uncovered something that could change everything again? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and for the first time since the battle had begun, doubt crept into her mind. Marcus, noticing the look on her face, moved closer. What happened? He asked, his voice filled with concern. It's Whitman, she said, shaking her head. He just called. He says he has evidence, something that could end this once and for all. But there's a catch. He wants me to make a deal. Marcus frowned. What kind of deal? I don't know, Layla replied. He wouldn't say. He just made it clear that if I don't accept, things are going to get worse. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Layla's instincts told her that Whitman was trying to manipulate her, to put her into a corner where she had no choice but to bargain with him. She couldn't let herself be swayed by the fear of what might happen next, no matter how much pressure he put on her. But as the days passed, the threat didn't go away. The media attention slowly began to shift. From Langford's fall to the ongoing drama surrounding the company's internal collapse. The pressure continued to build, and new, unexpected revelations seemed to surface daily. Stories of corruption, mistreatment, and greed that stretched far beyond anything they had initially uncovered. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that this fight was about more than just one corrupt executive. It was about a system designed to protect the powerful at any cost, no matter the destruction it left in its wake. One night, as Layla sat at her desk, reviewing the latest set of documents from their ongoing investigation, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from Samantha. Asterisk, they're after me. It's bad, I don't know how much longer I can hold on, asterisk. The urgency in the message hit Layla like a punch to the gut. She immediately called Samantha, but the phone rang without answer. Her anxiety spiked. What was happening? Was the company finally moving against Samantha, trying to silence her once and for all? Marcus had been in the other room, but when he saw the panic in her eyes, he rushed to her side. "What's wrong?" he asked. "It's Samantha," Layla said, her voice tight with worry. "She says they're after her. I don't know what that means, but I have to get to her." Without hesitation, they gathered their things and rushed out of the apartment. The streets outside felt unusually quiet, the weight of their mission pressing down on them with every step. When they arrived at Samantha's place, the door was ajar. Layla's heart raced as she pushed it open, calling out for her friend. "Samantha, are you here?" The apartment was eerily still, but then they heard a faint sound coming from the bedroom. Layla rushed inside to find Samantha sitting on the floor, staring at her phone, her hands trembling. She looked up, her face pale. "They know everything," Samantha whispered, her voice strained. "They know about the drive. They've been watching me, and they're going to make sure I pay for it. I'm not safe anymore." Layla crouched beside her, trying to calm her. "Samantha, listen to me. We're going to fix this. They can't hurt you if we stick together. But you need to tell us everything you know. All of it." Samantha hesitated, then reached for her bag. She pulled out a folder, filled with what appeared to be emails, photographs, and contracts. More evidence, more pieces of the puzzle that would expose the rot at the heart of the company. "I've been gathering this for years," Samantha said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know how deep it went. But now I see that it's bigger than just Langford or Whitman. It's the whole damn system." Layla's mind raced as she sifted through the papers. There were more hidden payments, false accounts, and even more damning evidence of misconduct by high-ranking officials. Samantha wasn't just a whistleblower anymore. She was the key to unraveling a network of corruption that stretched far beyond their initial understanding. Suddenly, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face draining of color. It was a message from an unknown number. "You know too much. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Asterisk. Layla's blood ran cold. "It's them," she said, her voice low and tense. "They're warning us again." Marcus clenched his jaw, determination flickering in his eyes. "They won't get away with this. We're not stopping now." But before they could formulate a plan, there was a loud bang at the door. Layla's heart leapt into her throat as she exchanged a quick glance with Marcus and Samantha. Someone was at the door. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and the door suddenly swung open. 3 men in dark suits entered, their faces cold and impassive. "You're coming with us," one of them said, his voice low and commanding. Layla stood, instinctively putting herself between Samantha and the men. "You're not taking her," she said, her voice firm. The man smirked, as if expecting her resistance. "We don't have time for games," he said. "This is your last chance to walk away. Don't make it worse for yourselves." But before anyone could react, Marcus moved quickly, his hand sliding into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small device and activated it with a click. A high-pitched noise filled the room, followed by an explosion of light. The men winced, momentarily blinded by the flash, giving Marcus and Layla just enough time to grab Samantha and make a run for it. They bolted down the hall, heartbeats pounding in their ears as they raced to the stairs. Behind them, they could hear the sound of the men recovering and giving chase. But they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. They ran through the streets, weaving between pedestrians and cars, not daring to look back. As they rounded a corner, Layla caught sight of something that made her stomach drop. A black car, parked on the street, its windows tinted dark. She knew it all too well. It was the company's security detail. "They've found us," Layla said, her voice breathless. "We need to get to a safe place, now." But before they could make another move, the sound of a car screeching to a halt behind them froze them in place. The doors of the black car opened, and 2 more figures stepped out. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down, the weight of their fight catching up with them. They had uncovered the truth, exposed the corruption, but now, it seemed like there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. As the figures advanced toward them, a single thought echoed in Layla's mind: this fight wasn't over. Not yet. As the figures emerged from the black car, Layla's heart pounded in her chest. The men who had chased them were closing in fast, but this time, they weren't going to be able to stop her. They had underestimated her, just like they had underestimated everyone who had been crushed by the system they had created. She wasn't afraid anymore, she was done being afraid. Marcus stepped forward, putting himself between Layla and the approaching figures. His voice was steady, but it was clear that he was ready for whatever came next. "You're not taking her," he said, His eyes locked on the men. "This ends now." One of the figures, the taller of the two, smiled darkly. "You think you've won, don't you? All of this, the media, the whistleblowing, it's all just a distraction. We've been through this before. You won't get far." But Layla could see the cracks in their armor. Their bravado was fading. They had no idea who they were up against. This was no longer about survival, it was about justice. And justice had a way of catching up with people, no matter how hard they tried to outrun it. Just as the tension in the air seemed ready to snap, Layla's phone buzzed again. She didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. Samantha had sent her a message. "Get to the safe house. Now." Layla didn't hesitate. She grabbed Marcus's arm and started running, her legs pumping with adrenaline. She could hear the men shouting behind them, but they were too slow. Layla and Marcus had already turned the corner, disappearing into the maze of alleyways that lined the city's streets. They reached the safe house, a small, inconspicuous apartment owned by a friend of Samantha's who had worked in the company's legal department. It was hidden away from the prying eyes of the security teams and the authorities. Samantha was already inside, pacing nervously. "They're still looking for us," Samantha said, her voice urgent. "But they don't know about this place. We'll be safe here for now." Layla nodded, still trying to catch her breath. "We don't have much time. They won't stop coming after us. We need to put everything together, everything we have." Marcus and Samantha helped Layla spread out the documents, the evidence they had gathered from months of digging. As they pieced everything together, it became clear just how deep the corruption ran. Langford, Whitman, and their colleagues hadn't just been manipulating the company. They had been exploiting entire communities, destroying lives, and funneling millions into their own pockets while people like Layla had been left in the dust. The stakes had always been higher than they had realized. But now, they had the truth. The full, unfiltered truth. They had enough to bring everything down. But it wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about sending a message that no one could ignore. This wasn't a fight just for themselves. It was for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every person who had suffered under the weight of systemic abuse. It was about standing up and saying enough. Layla picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. The line rang twice before someone picked up. "This is the tip line for investigative reporters. How can I help you?" "I need you to listen carefully," Layla said, her voice calm but determined. "I have the full story. All the evidence you need to take down one of the most powerful corporate structures in the country. But we need your help." For the next few hours, Layla, Marcus, and Samantha spoke with the reporters, explaining everything they had uncovered, providing the evidence, and detailing the extent of the corruption that had plagued the company for years. They were careful, precise, and thorough, making sure that every word counted. By morning, the news began to spread. At first, it was a whisper, but soon, the entire country was buzzing with the story. The press couldn't get enough. Every major outlet picked up the investigation, and the tide of public opinion shifted. The authorities had no choice but to act. Investigations were launched, arrests were made. Langford, Whitman, and the other executives were arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and more. The ripple effect reached far beyond the company. Other corporate giants that had been operating in the same corrupt way were also scrutinized. It was only a matter of time before Layla, Marcus, and Samantha were thrust back into the public eye. They'd become symbols of resistance, of the fight for truth. But as much as they had hoped for recognition, the attention made Layla uncomfortable. This wasn't about fame. This wasn't about them. This was about making sure that the powerful could no longer pull the strings without consequence. Months passed. The legal battles were long and grueling, but in the end, the system had to acknowledge the truth. The company was dismantled, Langford was sentenced to prison, and Whitman followed close behind. They'd all been exposed for what they were, corrupt, selfish, and ruthless. As the dust settled, Layla found herself standing at a crossroads. The fight had been exhausting, and she knew there would be more battles ahead. But this was a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the system. It was a reminder that even when the odds seemed impossible, change could happen. It just took courage, determination, and the will to keep going. Layla looked out over the city, a sense of peace settling over her. The journey had been long and difficult, but she had made it through. And in the end, it was all worth it. The road ahead wasn't clear, but Layla knew one thing for sure. She was no longer just a pawn in someone else's game. She had become the change she had always wanted to see in the world. And that, she realized, was the most powerful victory of all. Layla sat on the small balcony of her apartment, her eyes scanning the city below. The hustle and bustle had never seemed so distant, so far removed from the whirlwind that had become her life. She was still processing everything, the long nights, the fights, the betrayals, but it was finally over. She had never imagined that her fight for justice would lead her down such a perilous path. Yet, somehow, against all odds, she had emerged victorious. She thought back to those early days, the time when she had first heard about the corruption at the company, when it all seemed so distant, so hard to grasp. She had no idea how deep it went or how much it would cost her to expose it. But looking back now, she saw it as a turning point. That moment when she had decided not to look the other way. That moment when she had chosen to fight, even when it seemed like an impossible battle. It had been a journey of self-discovery, of understanding that sometimes the most important battles were the ones you fought for others, even at great personal risk. Layla had gone from an outsider to someone who had been able to stand toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful people in the corporate world. And it had all started with a single decision to confront the injustice in front of her. Behind her, she could hear Marcus's voice calling out, his usual playful tone cutting through the silence. "Are you going to stare at that sunset all day, or are we finally going to celebrate?" Layla smiled and turned around. Marcus was standing in the doorway, a bottle of champagne in his hand, grinning like he had already won. He had been there for her through it all, and though he never asked for it, she knew that the fight had taken a toll on him too. Yet, he was always there, always by her side. "We've earned it," Layla said, her voice full of gratitude. "But you're right, let's celebrate." As they clinked glasses, a sense of calm settled over her. There were still challenges ahead, she knew that. The public scrutiny, the new battles that would inevitably come as the ripple effects of the investigation continued to unfold. But in that moment, she allowed herself a brief, rare pause. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if we hadn't taken this on?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. Layla thought for a moment before answering. "I can't imagine not doing it. Maybe it would have been easier to just turn away, but I don't think I could have lived with myself. Sometimes you just have to do what's right, even if the cost is high." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, but you did it. You changed everything, and not just for yourself, but for so many others. You gave people a voice, Layla." She glanced down at her hands, remembering the countless hours she had spent digging through paperwork, collecting testimonies, and confronting people who would have done anything to silence her. She had always believed in justice, but it wasn't until she had to fight for it with everything she had that she truly understood the weight of her conviction. "We did it together," Layla said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We all did. You, Samantha, we're in this together." Samantha, who had stayed out of the spotlight as much as possible after the media frenzy died down, had been a key part of their success. Her quiet resilience had been the backbone of their efforts, her knowledge of the company's inner workings giving them the leverage they needed to expose the corruption at the highest levels. Although she didn't seek the limelight, Layla knew that without Samantha, none of this would have been possible. Samantha had gone on to start a foundation for whistleblowers, offering legal support and protection for those brave enough to speak out against the injustices they encountered. It wasn't easy, but it was a way to continue fighting for the greater good, one person at a time. But even as Layla relished in the victory, she knew that the work wasn't over. There were still people out there who would try to manipulate the system, still others who would try to take advantage of the vulnerable. She had learned that the fight for justice wasn't something that could be won once and for all. It was ongoing, a constant battle that required vigilance and action. And that thought gave her a sense of purpose. There was still more work to be done. As the night deepened, Layla found herself lost in her thoughts, her gaze drifting across the skyline. The city looked peaceful now, but she knew better. The calm before the storm. The world was a complicated, often broken place, and while it was easy to feel small in the face of it all, she had learned that change could happen. Real, tangible change. It could start with one person, one decision. In the weeks that followed, Layla received countless messages from people, former employees, community leaders, and even those who had been directly impacted by the corruption at the company. Their stories were heartbreaking, but they also reminded her of why she had fought in the first place. Every victory, big or small, mattered. Though Layla's life would never return to what it had been before the scandal, she no longer wished for that kind of normalcy. What she had found was something more important: purpose, community, and the knowledge that one person could make a difference. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And that in the end, the truth always found a way to come to light. She had started this journey as a voice in the dark, but now, as she looked out over the city that had once felt so intimidating, she realized that the darkness was receding. With the truth out there, the world had changed, and so had she. As Layla sipped her champagne and looked at Marcus, who was already planning their next steps, she knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to face, more systems to challenge, more injustices to expose. But for now, she could breathe. For the first time in a long while, she could truly relax, knowing that they had won, together. And with that, the story of one woman's fight for justice came to its natural conclusion, leaving the world a little bit better than it had been before. The fight would never end, but now, there were more people fighting alongside her, more voices demanding the truth. In the end, Layla had learned that the power of one person, of all of them, could change the course of history. And that was something worth celebrating.